This is Tom. I'm here.
Hi, Tom. Okay, Mr. Chair, we're ready to go.
All right.
Okay, this is the Monday, March 8th, 2021 meeting of the Architecture Advisory Committee for the City of Palm Springs. Mr. Knoll, could we please have a roll call?
Yes, Member Thompson,
I'm here.
Member Walsh, Member Paling,
Here.
Member McCoy,
Here.
Member Lockyer,
Here.
Member Dozy,
Present.
Vice Chair Rotman,
Here.
and Chair Jakeway.
Here.
All members are present.
Okay, with all members present, does Dan Thompson participate in discussion or voting?
He can participate in discussion, but he should not participate in the vote.
Okay, thank you. Could we please have a report on the posting of the agenda?
Yes, Chair and committee members, the agenda was posted on Thursday, March 4th. Our meeting has been published in accordance with state law.
Thank you. Does the committee have any revisions to the agenda? May we have a motion to accept the agenda?
I move to accept.
Thank you. Second by John McCoy. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay. This is a public meeting and audience members are permitted to comment on any item that is within this committee's purview. Comments on an item appearing on today's agenda are made at the time that that item is presented. If anybody has anything to speak to that is not on today's agenda, now is the time to speak. Mr. Newell, do we have anybody in the queue?
No, Mr. Chair, we have no requests to speak during this portion of the agenda.
Okay, thank you. So proceeding then to the minutes of the January 4th, 2021 meeting. Does anybody have any revisions to those meeting minutes?
Chair, I was not in that meeting, so I'm going to have to refrain from voting on it.
Thank you, Mr. Rotman. And I think the same from John Walsh.
That is correct.
Okay. Do the other members have any corrections or additions to these minutes? Do we have a motion to approve?
To approve.
From Steve, second.
Second.
Second from John McCoy. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, unfinished business, item number 2 on the agenda. Mike Flannery for a sign program application for Flannery Exchange, a multi-tenant commercial building located at 750 North Palm Canyon Drive. Do we have a staff report, please?
Yes. Right. As you may recall, the Aac reviewed this item on February 16th. And at the time, the committee voted and decided that the item to be further continued. Just to go over the project site one more time. The project site is a multi-tenant commercial buildings in the C1 zone. And it's a 2-story building, as you can see in this image. The building is, and it's going to be utilized by multiple uses that include co-working space, the office spaces, cafe/restaurant and retail tenant spaces, and the common spaces. And this is the view of the building from the primary elevation, which is on North Palm Canyon. And additional images of the site. And the image on the left side at the bottom, that is the rear elevation of the building on North Indian Canyon Drive. As you may recall, previously the applicant proposed the installation of 13 signs. And since then, after receiving comments from the AAC, the applicant has revised the plan And the one of the comments that was received was that the project is proposing too much signage. So the applicant has decided to reduce the amount of signage for the building. So these are the signs that have been removed from the previous sign program. And before there were 13 signs, but now there are only 8 signs total for this property that's been proposed. The applicant has also revised the design of the freestanding signs. The proposed sign does not include the tenant names anymore. The height has been slightly reduced, so has the area. The construction of the sign itself has not really changed. The sign background is going to be a painted aluminum sheeting in a corten steel finish, and it's going to accommodate acrylic, the building name, Family Exchange, and then also it's going to include some decorative trim element and the painted Eat, Shop, and Work signage. The applicant is also proposing changes to the blade signs. As you can see here, the amount has been reduced by 50%. So instead of 4 signs, the applicant is now proposing 2 signs, and the size of the signs also has been reduced significantly. Previously, the projection was proposed for 43 inches. However, that's been changed to 29. And this graphic shows how much of a reduction in the size the applicant is proposing. These signs are previously proposed on the North Palm Canyon side, North Palm Canyon Drive frontage. Since the last meeting, the applicant has decided to remove the sign that was proposed on the above the driveway, as well as the fascia of the canopy structure. And for the rear elevation, the applicant has decided to remove the building ID signage. So these signs has been reduced, have been omitted from the revised sign program. So the quantity of signage has been reduced, and the proposed signs now conform to the applicable zoning regulations. And freestanding signs will be fully located on the private property. So based on these findings, the staff recommends AAC recommend approval to the Development Services Director as proposed. And this is the end of staff presentation, and applicant is available if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Noriko. Does the committee have any questions of the staff?
I had one quick one.
Robert?
Yeah, so Noriko, are signs 1.1 and 1.2, those are the signs on Indian Canyon and Palm Canyon. Are they the same design?
No, the design has been changed. I'm sorry, I see what you're saying. Yes, the sign designs are identical on both frontages, and the revised design is shown on this slide here on the right side.
Okay, great, thank you.
Any other questions of staff? Okay, thank you. Would the applicant like to, you have 10 minutes to present your project. Noriko, can you bring them in?
Sure. Let's see.
I think I'm in. Am I in?
Okay, yes, you are.
Okay.
Give
Good
us
evening,
your name,
everybody.
please.
Yes, this is John Cross, Best Signs. Thank you for the time to look at this once again. I had a chance to go over with the owner regarding quantities of signs, sign locations. Yeah, as you can imagine, a building owner is going to want to get as much as they possibly can for signage. That doesn't always bode well for the overall look, and that's why you guys are here to make sure that there's not a proliferation of signage, and I understand that. So we reduced the number of signs on the building, and also removed the tenant panels from the freestanding signs. So the freestanding signs are more utilized now to just identify the building, so people know that they're walking into or driving past Flannery Exchange. And the sign locations have been reduced to just allow for a number of tenants to, get their name on the building. The blade signs were reduced. I did take note of the blade signs, having 4 of them when there's only access to 2 suites. That makes sense to me. A blade sign is supposed to be an entry point, so that's why we reduced those as well. So essentially, I removed as much as I could with what the building owner was comfortable with, and that's the result. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you. At this point would be a time for public comments from the audience. Mr. Newell, do you know if there's anybody wanting to comment on this item?
No requests to speak, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Does the committee have any questions for the applicant? Sean? Sean, you're muted. We're not hearing you.
Seems like one of the questions we had last time was removing the some of the building signage. Was that a change that was made?
Yes, yeah, there was, I think there on the building signage, I think there was originally 7 locations. That has been reduced to 4.
Wow, okay, cool.
John, I would like to confirm on the freestanding sign, which I think looks so much better than the previous one. It says that it's going to be made of aluminum painted to match Corten steel. I want to make sure it's painted to match, that it's not really Corten, so we don't have to deal with the rusting as it drips.
Absolutely, yeah, it'll be a faux finish paint, and then it will be cleared, and there will be no issue with maintenance or actual rust.
Great, thank you. Any other questions of the applicant? Okay, thank you, Mr. Cross.
Thank you.
Committee discussion. What sort of comments do we have?
I feel it's a big improvement.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I think what I would add is it's the difference between non-compliant and compliant. And the staff report was pretty clear, and the issues evaporated that we were concerned about, as I see it.
Any other comments? I agree with these 2 comments. I think they've done a good job in responding to our concerns. Do we have a motion?
Motion to approve as the redesign is presented.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second by John Walsh. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cross.
Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to move to a kind of different sort of item for us, and it's a discussion of the changes to the architectural review process. And I'm going to turn the meeting over now to Planning Director Flynn Fagg, who has been very involved with this and would be the best to kind of lead us through this discussion. At the end of this, we are not making a motion, but we're going to see whatever comments the AAC has that Flynn can take back to whomever he needs to work with. Flynn?
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. And thank you, members of the Architectural Advisory Committee. Appreciate you all moving your meeting to accommodate us tonight, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts and comments on proposed changes to the architectural review process. what I'd like to do, this is a little bit different than what we typically do with the Architectural Advisory Committee in that, let's see, can you all see my screen?
Not
Nope.
yet.
Oh,
Not yet. Okay, David, I might need to have you help me. Just a moment. Typically, the AAC is not involved in modifications to the city's zoning code. However, because of the fact that this will affect the architectural review process, we would like the AAC to review the proposed changes, and we'll see if we can get my screen to work here in just a moment. There it is. Okay, thanks, David. So let me start at the very beginning. In January of 2020, the City Council held a discussion on the city's architectural review process and our entitlement processes in general. And at that City Council meeting, they provided direction to staff on a couple of measures that they wanted us to look at. Number one, they wanted us to look at reversing the architectural review and planning commission process. And I'll talk a little bit more about the reasons for doing that in just a moment. Secondly, they wanted us to look at how we might be able to move applications through the process more quickly, and specifically looking at how we could limit the number of hearings while still getting the same end result, that being architectural review by a body who would adequately scrutinize projects as they're going through the process. And then number three, they wanted us to look at overall streamlining our application processes. So their goals were primarily to look at how we could be more effective and move applications through a process more quickly without giving up the level of review that's necessary for some of our major projects, understanding that Palm Springs has a unique architectural heritage, and that's something that we want to protect. So with that in mind, the Planning Commission appointed a subcommittee to study the issue in July of 2020. And on the subcommittee, we had Kathy Wehrmuck, who is chair of the Planning Commission, Maria Song, a former member of AAC, who is now on the Planning Commission, and then Chair Jakeway, representing the AAC, was also on our subcommittee. So with that, the subcommittee began a process of studying how we might be able to do architectural review more effectively. In terms of why we would want to do that, there are a couple of issues to address. As you all have seen in past applications that have come through, especially where there are waivers requested, or there's a conditional use permit that deals with operations. It's been difficult for the AAC to approve the architecture when there are still aspects of the site plan that hasn't been approved by the Planning Commission yet. And so you all are working with unclear boundaries in terms of what your responsibilities are. Another issue that we have seen is that there's an overlap between the duties of the Architectural Advisory Committee and the Planning Commission. And so sometimes there are differences of opinion in terms of our criteria. And so that has been an issue sometimes in the past. And then third, and I think you've seen this in some of the applications, because AAC is first, it does a disservice to the public in that they come to the first meeting where they've learned of a project and they want to give you all of their concerns and their questions. And AAC really isn't the place to do some of that. For example, when we had Parker Hall, the expansion to the Parker Hotel, come through the process recently, we had a lot of people who were concerned about traffic issues and some other aspects of the development that is really outside of the scope of the AAC. And because you all were first in the process, that's where everyone wanted to give their comments instead of waiting until the Planning Commission hearing. So there's a number of reasons why we might consider changing the order of the process for AAC and Planning Commission. And that was one of the things that the subcommittee looked at, was the order of the approval process. The subcommittee also looked at how other cities do this. We always look at what other cities in the Coachella Valley are doing because our developers go to the other cities as well. Our architects, our sign professionals, they work in the other cities. So we looked at how other cities do it. We also looked at a number of cities across the state of California in terms of ones that might be models for how to do architectural review. And then finally, we also looked to the American Planning Association, my professional organization, who has materials on the architectural review process. And so the subcommittee looked at all of those things. What they kept in their mind was not only were we looking for a process that was more efficient in terms of the time frame, but still maintained the level of scrutiny that's necessary here in Palm Springs relative to architectural quality. Some of the things that we learned in doing that study process is that Palm Springs has no separate site plan approval process, that we have a combined process, which is kind of unique that you don't see in other cities. Most other cities keep the site plan review process separate from the architectural review process. So we looked at that. Also, many other cities employ some type of a pre-submittal conference process with staff, whereby a staff member will sit down with an applicant before they have submitted formal applications, will review their project for conformance to criteria, both development standards such as height, setbacks, parking spaces, things like that, but also looking at any architectural criteria that that city might have. Another thing that we learned from the study was that architectural review is typically a discrete process, and it's usually limited to specific areas of a city. Palm Springs, again, is kind of unique in that it applies to all commercial districts in our city. And also extends to residential districts in certain cases as well. So there's a number of ways that we're unique. We looked for best practices from other cities to look at what they were doing before getting into really looking at how we might make modifications to our existing code. So looking at our regulations as they currently exist for our architectural review process, it essentially goes as follows on the screen. Step one is the formal submittal of the application. Staff takes in the application. We then route it to other departments for review, prepare a staff report. Step two is you, the Architectural Advisory Committee. So you all review the application, you make your comments, and you vote on the application. Step three is Planning Commission. So they take into consideration the recommendation of the AAC, and then they either approve it, or in certain cases where city council approval is required, for example, for general plan amendments, change of zone applications, et cetera, then it is forwarded on to the city council. So it looks pretty simple as you look at it in terms of a diagram. However, in practice, it actually is a little bit more complicated than that. What typically happens is after the formal submittal, we take it to AAC, and for whatever reason, the applicant may need to redesign their project. And so it comes back to AAC again until you all are comfortable that it meets our criteria. And then you'll forward it to the Planning Commission. Planning Commission will take a look at it, and sometimes they'll redesign it again, and it will go through that process. And so it's understandable that sometimes applicants are frustrated that once they've submitted their formal application, there are still a number of redesigns to the project. And so what we'd like to look at is a slightly different process where we spend more time with the application up front before it gets to Planning Commission and AAC. And so what we're proposing is that step one, prior to the formal submittal, would be a required pre-submittal conference with staff. The intent of that is to review the schematic design of the project for conformance to our architectural criteria, look at conformance to development standards, again, parking requirements, setbacks, height limits, open space, And then also to go over the required submittal materials. Part of the difficulty in you all making decisions on projects is because you don't have all of the drawings and the information that you need to make a decision. And so that's another reason for having a pre-submittal conference, is to sit down with applicants and go through what are all the required submittal materials that the AAC and Planning Commission would need to make a decision. One of the other changes that we are proposing is to split the process in two, in that there would be a separate architectural review application and a separate site development permit application. The architectural review application would go to Architectural Advisory Committee. The site development permit application would go to the Planning Commission. What we are attempting to do there is to give you all discrete responsibilities so that there isn't the overlap or the conflict between the two groups. What we would propose is that the Planning Commission take action on the site development permit application first. Once that is approved and the site plan is more or less set, we would then forward that on to the Architectural Advisory Committee to review the architectural review application. If there was a need for City Council action on the site plan, then that would happen in between the Planning Commission and the AAC review. One of the questions that has come up in the planning discussion of this process is, would the Planning Commission and AAC still see the same materials even though there are two technically separate applications? And the answer to that is yes. I think it's important that both the Planning Commission and the AAC see the same applications, even though you'll be taking different actions. Let me go on and talk a little bit more about this process. So in terms of the pre-submittal conference, again, it's intended to kind of weed out some of the issues with an application prior to it going forward through the process, so that we can give you an application with all of the materials and all of the questions answered. It also gives us the opportunity to, again, critique the architectural design based on our criteria, and also review for conformance to development standards. So the intent of the pre-submittal conference is to wind up with a better application as we take that through the process. Again, going into the proposed application types, the Planning Commission would review the site development permit. And so they would look at the use, they would look at the layout of the site, conformance to development standards. They would do the CEQA review or the environmental impact review, and then approve the site development permit. And then Architectural Advisory Committee would look at the architectural details, the colors and materials, the landscaping materials, placement of landscaping materials, lighting, hardscape, all of the functions of architecture. To help you understand what the difference between what Planning Commission is looking at and what AAC is looking at, I'm just going to go through the approval criteria for both of those two permits that we're talking about. So let me start with Planning Commission first. So these are the things that the Planning Commission will be looking at. Number one, they'll look at conformance to the general plan. Does it conform to the general plan density, floor area ratio, use? Secondly, they'll be looking at the use relative to the zone district where the site is located and impacts to adjacent sites. They'll look at conformance to development standards, and I use that as shorthand for setbacks, height, lot coverage, parking, etc. They'll also be looking at, is the proposed height and massing of the project compatible with adjacent sites? They'll look at the building placement relative to adjacent sites. So they're looking at the context and making sure that what is proposed is consistent with the context. Another thing that they're looking at is issues relative to traffic. In terms of the number of trips generated or vehicle miles traveled, which is the new standard under the state. They'll also look at the alignment of driveways or streets within the project with the existing grid. Again, looking at issues relative to the layout of the site plan. They'll look at issues of on-site circulation, both for vehicles and for pedestrians. Look at adequacy of landscape areas and open space, utilities, are they available next to the site, CEQA, and then any general health, safety, and welfare impacts. So those are the things that the Planning Commission would review and then approve as part of the site development permit. Moving on to the architectural review process. So the criteria that I'm going through now, these are the things that you all as the AAC would be looking at. So architectural treatment being consistent on all four sides of the building. It's one of the things that you would look at. So consistency of treatment. You would also look at the design of accessory structures in terms of the materials, colors. Are those consistent with the principal structure? So looking at carports and things like that on the site. You'd look at the composition of facade elements and the fenestration in terms of the aesthetics of the facade treatment. You would also look at the appropriateness of the materials relative to its context. So looking at the adjacent buildings. And here in hillside areas, this is most important, looking at, are the materials appropriate for a desert environment on a hillside in terms of what is proposed there. You would also look at the color scheme. So is it appropriate for its context? Is it appropriate for hillside areas or the desert context? Another thing that you would look at is shading and solar orientation. So looking at window openings, is there adequate shading of those openings in terms of the building and its layout relative to the seasons and the sun? Landscape plan is another important component that you would review. Consistency for our water efficient landscape ordinance and for any other landscape requirements that we've adopted. We would also look at adequacy of shading of sidewalks, parking lots, and pedestrian facilities if they have any seating areas outside on the site. You would look at your lighting plan conformance to code. John McCoy, we can't afford to lose you because you're our expert in that regard. We would also look at sign locations and placement in terms of where those might be located either on the building or on the site and the appropriateness of those locations. Screening of mechanical equipment and service areas. And then finally, consistency with any adopted design standards. Currently, Miralon has design standards, the Ascena development has design standards, and any other design standards that we may adopt at any point in the future. So those are the things that you would be reviewing. And again, what we're trying to do is to eliminate the overlap between what Planning Commission reviews and what Architectural Advisory Committee reviews so that you have discrete responsibilities. We feel that this is something that will help to shorten the process by reducing the overlap while still maintaining the adequacy of the reviews that we do at our board and commission levels. What I'd like to do next is talk a little bit about how this process would work, looking at a couple of different examples. So we've had some commercial drive-throughs come in recently, the Starbucks, Cane's, Raising Cane's Chicken. Let's use that as an example for one of these. So what would happen with a commercial building with a drive-through is that first they would come in and meet with staff. We would look at their schematic design, give them comments on the site layout, give them comments on the architectural and materials, landscaping, and then finally give them a checklist of these are all the things that you'll need to submit with your application. Your color and materials board, your roof plan, show us where the signage is going to be located on the building, et cetera, et cetera. They would then formally submit both their architectural review application and their site development permit application. And because this one requires a conditional use permit for the drive-through, they would submit that at the same time. We would do our review for completeness, circulate it to other departments, and then prepare our staff reports. After that, it would then go to the Planning Commission, and Planning Commission would review the site plan, conformance to development standards, et cetera, as part of their review. They would also review the conditional use permit and approve it. And one of the things that we've discussed is if they have comments on the architecture, they would be able to forward those comments on to you as the Architectural Advisory Committee. Keep in mind, however, that those are just comments and not part of their approval of the site plan. Once they are approved at the Planning Commission level, the application would then be forwarded to the Architectural Advisory Committee, and you all would review for the architectural character and conformance to our architectural standards. So you would look at the details, the design of all 4 elevations of the building, the landscape materials, placement of the landscaping, shading, lighting, etc. And so once the architectural review is approved, they could then go forward to building permits. And so that's how it would work with a commercial building. Moving on to another type, one of the changes that we're proposing is that for hillside reviews of single-family residences, currently the process requires review both by the AAC and the Planning Commission. What the subcommittee has recommended is that only the AAC would review hillside houses in the future. And so Planning Commission would no longer be involved in those reviews. You as the AAC would have the sole responsibility for review and approval of houses in hillside areas and also on major thoroughfares. So for a hillside house, the process would go as follows. Step 1 is the pre-submittal conference with staff. Just like a commercial project, we'd review it for conformance to development standards, conformance to architectural standards, and then provide a checklist of submittal requirements. Next, they would formally submit their application. In this case, it would just be an architectural review application. So 1 application instead of the 2, and then it would go to AAC and you all would review and approve the project at that point. So this helps to shorten the process by removing Planning Commission from these types of reviews and leaving it solely to the responsibility of the AAC. And so that's how we would improve the process there with those particular types of applications. Give me just a moment. The subcommittee looked at other processes as well. We didn't just focus on the architectural review process. One of the other processes that we discussed was the signage process, one that you've been through this evening. In terms of sign programs, what is being proposed is that AAC would also have final action on any sign programs where waivers are required. So instead of a 2-step process that we have now with AAC and Planning Commission, we would cut it down to just a 1-step process where AAC would have final action on sign programs. Sign districts, which are basically sign programs for an area. One of the ones that we'll be looking at here in the near future is for the downtown area, or the downtown project. Miralon is another project that has a sign district as it covers 300 acres and they have multiple signs throughout the property. For sign districts, what we're proposing is that currently City Council has final action on sign districts. We're proposing to move that down to the Planning Commission and let them have final action on sign district applications. We looked at other things that don't really fall under the responsibility of the AAC. For example, conditional use permits. Currently, there's a process that requires certain conditional use permits having to be approved by City Council. We're also modifying that process. But again, that's not something that impacts the AAC. We put together a chart of review processes, and this is in your backup materials, looking at how this might change with the proposed changes to the process. Again, looking at changes to architectural and site plan review, who will have final action there. Also looking at signs and sign districts, sign programs, who will have final action there, and conditional use permits. And so this table helps to summarize the changes that are being proposed. One of the questions that I've had at the Planning Commission level is how do these proposed changes assist in streamlining the process? Going back to some of the things that I've discussed, number one is the elimination of duplicate reviews. So in the past, where something required the approval of both AAC and Planning Commission, what we've tried to do is give AAC authority where it's appropriate to do so. Secondly, we are looking at using a pre-submittal conference to do more work on the front end of an application to make sure it's ready to move forward through the process so that what you'll be reviewing is a complete application with all of the information that you all need to make decisions and hopefully speed your process along. And then third, trying to eliminate the overlap of responsibilities between AAC and Planning Commission. So applicants aren't stuck trying to go back and forth between what AAC has recommended versus what Planning Commission is directing them to do. And so we think that's another thing that will help to speed up the process in terms of getting through the approval process. So those are the changes that we're proposing. There's a couple of other steps that we'd like to look at. In addition to looking at changes to our architectural review process, we think that there's a phase 2 of this process that the City Council needs to take into considerations. One of the things that might help speed the process for applicants is the adoption of design guidelines. Right now, what we have are very loose criteria, but they don't really help to offer insight to applicants in terms of what we as boards and commissions are looking for in terms of architectural character. And so what I would recommend, and this is one of the recommendations I'll make to the City Council as they look at the changes to our architectural review process, is to consider the adoption of design guidelines as well. The Palm Springs Architectural Alliance, which is a citizens alliance of design professionals here in the community, has offered to help in that regard. What we might recommend is once City Council approves the architectural review process changes, that they look at putting together a task force or subcommittee to study the issue of design guidelines. That would include a representative from the AAC, from Planning Commission, and members of the design community. So that's more or less phase 2 of the project that we would like the City Council to consider, and something that we think could help in speeding applicants through the process by having design guidelines that they can review and look to as they're working through the schematic design of a project. Another important component of these proposed changes is to have a staff member with architectural background and experience that can assist with our pre-submittal conferences. So basically what I'd be looking for is to add a staff person who would be able to administer the pre-submittal conference process, meet with applicants, and then also bring projects forward to the AAC. So I see this individual as working closely with the AAC as projects are brought through the review process. So that would be another critical component that would help us be more successful in trying to get a better product before you as well. So those are some of the additional considerations that we also need to look at. And these are things that I'll be presenting to the City Council as they begin their discussion on changes to the architectural review process. With that, that concludes my presentation to you this evening. As Chair Jakeway indicated, we're not taking a vote on this, but rather what I'd like to do is to get your comments here this evening on the proposed changes. I'd be happy to answer questions in terms of how this process would work if I wasn't quite clear in explaining that. But I'd like to forward your comments on to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission will be having a formal public hearing on this on Wednesday evening. And so I would present your comments to the Planning Commission as part of my presentation on Wednesday. With that, that concludes my portion of the agenda. Mr. Chair, I'll turn it back over to you for questions of the AAC and comments.
Okay, and let me make one comment for the committee. Notice that this committee will have a new name. Instead of being the Architectural Advisory Committee, it will be the Architectural Review Committee. And that's indicating that we are not advising the Planning Commission and they make the final choices on the architecture. It's indicating that we make the final choices on the architecture. And that's kind of the basic change of this whole process. So having said that, questions or comments from committee members for Flynn? I know it's a lot to absorb, so while you are all thinking, let me just go through a few things I had, Flynn.
Certainly.
Let's use the Raising Cane's project as an example. Say it gets approved by the Planning Commission, and then it comes to us for architectural review. Currently, we're only allowed to review the project twice, and then it would go to the Planning Commission for fun. What happens now if after 2 meetings we don't approve it? Does it come back to us again?
If you don't approve a project after 2 meetings, what the applicant would need to do is to resubmit the application. So if you can't make the findings that it meets our architectural review criteria, or you can't do conditions of approval that will bring it into conformance, then what that tells us is it really does not meet the criteria and the applicant needs to reconsider. If they have an approved site plan from the Planning Commission, it doesn't mean that they go back to square one. It just means for the architectural portion of that application, so the architectural materials, the fenestration, the composition of the facades, et cetera, that's the portion that they would need to resubmit and go through again.
So if the architectural corrections involved changing the footprint of the building, but not the location of the building, would that need Planning Commission approval, or is that a close enough, or is that something the planning director would decide?
It depends on how much the change to the footprint of the building would be. If it was an insignificant change or a minor change where it doesn't result in any major reconfiguration of the parking area or the pedestrian access or things like that, simply shifting position here or there in order to give variety to the facade or things like that. I think that would be appropriate to keep it at the level of the AAC, and it wouldn't need to go back to the Planning Commission. But if you all were recommending significant changes to the footprint of the building, we may need to take that back to the Planning Commission to get their blessing.
Okay. Committee members, other questions or comments?
Tom?
Question.
Who are we looking at? Robert?
Yeah, hi. So a couple of things. On your matrix of the proposed changes, I noticed in the middle under architectural review, site plan review, major, under the new multifamily residential, that is up to Planning Commission, and AAC or ARC would not be involved. And when I think about Miralon and the subcommittees that we had between AAC and Planning Commission to review the architecture of the individual houses individually and as a whole, that seemed like it was a pretty important component in that process. And it seems like that's been eliminated.
Good catch, Mr. Rotman. That was not the intent. For certain applications under state law, under processing under Senate Bill 35, it limits the reviews that cities can have relative to architectural requirements, but it doesn't limit all residential reviews. So my mistake there. For those that aren't subject to the state streamlining, they would still be subject to architectural review. And Miralon is a good example. So for example, when a new single family subdivision is proposed, where you're going to have models that are repeated throughout the development, that would still come forward to the AAC to review the architecture of those houses. Certain multifamily projects would still come before you for review and approval of the architecture as well. It's only those that would be exempted under state law that wouldn't come before you. So again, let me make a change to that chart.
And then the other example that comes to mind is the proposed new condominium project on the Virgin Hotel site downtown. That project came before AAC, and I don't think it really, the message of what the committee was proposing or thought would be better was that project was designed to around a courtyard, and it basically filled the site. And for a variety of reasons, the committee felt that that was not the appropriate plan for a project downtown. It went forward, and Planning Commission, I believe, approved it as is or made some minor adjustments. In a situation like that, where there's such a disparity between what the committee thinks and what ultimately is approved, how would that be addressed?
So with that particular example, that's within the downtown specific plan. And the Planning Commission has had a discussion about how we address architectural review for specific plan areas. We have really 4 specific plans that have been adopted where this would impact the review process. The downtown specific plan, which is basically the downtown redevelopment, the Desert Palisades specific plan, which is primarily the individual single-family hillside homes in that area. We have the College Park specific plan, which is the former College of the Desert site on the north end of town. And then we have the Section 14 specific plan. All of those, in some ways, talk about the architectural review process as it currently stands and may need to be amended at some point in the future. In discussing those changes, the Planning Commission has some ideas what they would like to see happen with the downtown in particular. One of the things that they have suggested is for the downtown that there would be a joint pre-application of the AAC and the Planning Commission to discuss those issues in advance of the formal submittal. So that's one of the things that we might see happen as part of this if we were to amend the specific plan to do that. But just talking generally, where there is a significant difference of opinion in terms of the Planning Commission and the AAC relative to a site plan, I don't know that we'll have any extreme examples like what we just saw in the downtown area in our normal process, but occasionally for more complex developments, what we will still continue to do is to have a pre-application. So that way we can address those types of concerns up front before it goes through the formal approval process. So that's how I would recommend that we handle that.
Thank you.
While we're looking at the matrix plan right above where Robert was talking, new mobile home parks, you indicate that it's not reviewed by the Planning Commission, but it is reviewed by the Architecture Advisory. I think that should be reversed.
Okay, and that may again be another error. My apologies.
Sean, you have some comments or questions?
Just that you talk about 2 application types. So is it possible that, or am I misunderstanding that in some ways it becomes a little bit more cumbersome for a developer or the applicant that there's actually 2 applications now in some ways, or am I just misunderstanding that?
No, you're correct, Mr. Lockyer.
Okay.
It would be 2 separate applications. One of the things that can make that less cumbersome is if we require the same materials for both applications, in that you're not preparing separate materials for one body and for the other. Planning Commission really wants to see the architecture that you all are going to decide. And I'm assuming that you all really want to see the site plan materials as well. And so we thought it would be important that the submittal be the same for both bodies, but just 2 separate application forms. What we are attempting to do is, because we're splitting this process into AAC and Planning Commission, 2 different application forms, 1 application package in effect, we're also trying to keep the fees the same as they are now. The last thing we want to do is to increase fees for this process. And so we're going to be very mindful of that. Now, in certain cases, for example, where only AAC is going to be reviewing items like Hillside houses, you should see a reduction in the fee for those applications because it's not going to two bodies. It's less staff time for us to prepare one report instead of two reports. So we're trying to make it not be as cumbersome as it sounds. Keep in mind that we're also moving towards an electronic submittal software system here in the near future. We're building it right now as we speak. We're meeting with our consultant. We hope to have something online within about 8 to 12 months is what we're hoping for. With that, applicants will no longer be providing us with paper copies of drawings. They'll be giving us PDFs. And so that's something that will also ease the burden for applicants as well. So we're trying to be mindful of that. In some ways, it is a little cumbersome having two applications, but what we're trying to do is to keep the application standardized in terms of the submittal materials.
Okay.
I have a question.
Sure, Tom.
To what level will the planning commission review the site plans? Will they be reviewing items such as dumpsters and trash locations, or just conformance with setbacks and other zoning ordinance factors?
They will need to look at things as that as well. One of the key things that the Planning Commission is looking at is not only conformance to development standards, but impacts to adjacent properties. And so where you place your dumpster, for example, is it next to a single family property, or is it at the rear of the property where it doesn't impact others? They'll need to look at that. So they will look at the placement of those things. But in terms of the materials, the screening, things like that, that's where you all as the Architectural Advisory Committee come into play.
Okay, and with that, so it's possible though that some items may need to return to the planning commission in the same way sometimes items return to the AAC, is that correct?
We're hoping that that doesn't become necessary. I don't think we'll really know until we have a number of applications under our belt. We've taken them through the process and we can see how the process works. One of the things that we've discussed at the Planning Commission level is to do a review, if this process is adopted, to do a review after 12 months, to sit down with Planning Commission and AAC and see if it really is working. But we're hoping that we don't have to go back and forth between the two bodies by keeping their review responsibilities separate. One of the questions that has come up, and I'm glad you brought this up, Tom, is what happens for appeals? Let's say, for example, that the AAC denies the architectural review. In that case, it could be appealed to the Planning Commission. And so there is the possibility that something that gets denied by the AAC does go forward to the Planning Commission on appeal. We look to the city of Santa Monica in terms of their process. And what they have found is that they have very few appeals. After the site plan has been approved by the Planning Commission, the architecture is then reviewed by their architectural review board. But they haven't had many appeals of the architectural approvals or denials.
Okay, great, thank you.
Anybody else with questions?
Yeah, I had one. I noticed you addressed it, the pre-submittal conference with staff. I was, as you were reading it, I was thinking that there should be some architectural representation in that session to make sure that they're prepping the applicant for what we're going to be looking for. And you said you were going to potentially staff it. And what I was wondering is if it potentially could be a rotating position, one of the members of the AAC or ARC that could rotate into that and play that role for those pre-submittal conferences.
You know, that's a question that has come up. One of the other suggestions that we had is that the chair of the AAC should sit in and do all of those pre-submittal conferences.
Flynn, nobody would ever want to be chair then.
A lot of work. That's why I was thinking it was rotating, because it's a lot of work. on
Yeah,
top of
it's,
everything else.
it's difficult to ask our volunteer board and committee members to be available like they would need to be for the pre-submittal conferences. Having managed a pre-submittal conference in another city, it takes a lot of time in terms of the scheduling of the conference, reviewing the materials, and then the actual meetings themselves. It would really need to be a staff person who does that to have the access to the resources that we have in terms of being able to schedule, pull in members of the engineering staff or building and safety staff as may be needed, and to do the checklists and to work with our software system. So it really would need to be a staff member to be able to do that in terms of the commitment of time and the availability of the resources.
Right. Okay, great.
And one question, and those pre-submittal, that includes, I remember they used to call it the development committee, and they'd have, fire in there, engineering, planning. Is it a similar type group of departments that would be reviewing the applications?
To the degree that we can, yes, it would be a similar type of situation. Based on the application type, for example, for a hillside house, we probably don't need the other disciplines represented if it's in a subdivision that's already been approved and is already graded. But in other types of situations, major new development, then fire and engineering would need to be invited. So it would be based on the application type, but yes, we would want to bring in the other departments where it's helpful for the applicant to understand some of the issues that may influence their site design.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Dan,
It says under conditional use permits, the cell towers, that the planning commission would approve those. What about in a situation like we had in a couple meetings back where they're extending the elevator shafts and the parking structure that's very visible and seems to be more of an architectural thing? What about something like that? How would that be affected?
That's a good question, and one that I hadn't thought of. Typically, cell towers don't involve new architecture, if you will. But that parking garage application is a good example of one where we would want the AAC involved in that process. Let me think about that in terms of how we might handle that. Because again, that's a great point where we would want AAC to look at the architecture. And that's not going to be for every cell tower, but certain ones where they're located on tops of buildings or adding on to an existing building, we would want architectural review. So thank you for bringing that up. That's a good point.
John Walsh, anything?
Yeah, Flynn, as you look at this, if it were to gel in terms of all of the specifics, when and how would it roll out? Like one big cutover date, or is this something that would piecemeal ramp up?
Here's what I anticipate. In terms of being able to implement this does require a number of changes to processes that we currently have underway. I would expect that we would probably give ourselves several months to roll this out. So for example, our next fiscal year starts on July the 1st. That might be a good date as the effective date to start the new process. So we would probably need to give ourselves a couple of months. If City Council is amenable to having a new staff person or adding a staff person, that would certainly take time for us to be able to hire that person.
Right.
I would want to have someone available before I begin this process and start going down the road with pre-submittal conferences, because we really need to have someone with architectural experience in order to initiate it. So I anticipate that it would take us several months in order to begin the process. That would also give applicants time to understand the changes to the process and to be able for us to line up applicants into the proper channels in terms of going through the process. So for example, if someone has a hillside house where the new process will only require review by the AAC. We wouldn't want to take them to Planning Commission and then turn around and say, oh, only AAC is necessary. So again, I think we need a couple of months to really get that ready and get it ready to go.
John McCoy, haven't heard from you yet, I don't think. Do you have any comments?
Is there any change to at what point the public is engaged in the process and how they're notified?
Here's what we're hoping is that because the Planning Commission will be seeing projects first, they will be able to engage with the Planning Commission at that point. They would also be able to engage with the AAC as the project comes to AAC for architectural review and approval. So they would still have two opportunities for most application types. Where that would change is for sign programs and for hillside houses or houses on major thoroughfares. The AAC, as they are the only ones who will be looking at those applications, that would be the only opportunity for the public to engage on those types of applications.
Flynn?
I have a question regarding that. So say, for instance, you have a neighbor on a hillside home. Who would they appeal to? In other words, say the AAC approves the hillside project, and the owner would they have any adjacent property owner? Would they have any option to appeal either to the city council for final?
Correct, they would. On architectural approvals, the appeal process would be to the Planning Commission. So they would be able to appeal to the Planning Commission. Just as we brought up the issue of public comment, currently our ordinance requires a notice for hillside houses that we do notice to the adjacent property owners. That process will continue so that adjacent property owners are aware and have the ability to comment at the AAC level or appeal in the case of an approval or denial.
Okay, thanks.
Flynn, a couple of small comments. Through your matrix and through both of the ordinances, where you refer to tennis courts, do you think you should change that word to sport courts?
We had that discussion at a staff level that that may be appropriate with pickleball coming all the rage now in Palm Springs, it seems.
And then on page 3 of the Architectural Review Committee proposed ordinance, under paragraph I, it says things that need review are additions or alterations to class 1 and 2 historic resources which increase the existing floor area by more than 25%, excluding class 1 and class 2 single family residential. I might not be understanding that, but I would think that we would have to review any change to a building, even if it didn't increase the square footage. And as an example, if you look at the Kaufman House, you know, we had the Angels of the Harrises come in and do that spectacular renovation, but somebody else who bought that might say, geez, I hate these still louvers. I want to enclose this upper deck with glass windows. And it would totally demolish the integrity of the house. Do you think it's maybe appropriate that we take out the reference to 25% increase and also include single family residentials and things that would need to be reviewed if they're class 1 or 2 historical?
I don't think so. One of the things that this doesn't reference is the fact that under the Historic Preservation Ordinance, the Historic Site Preservation Board has to review alterations to class 1 and class 2 structures, including single family. So there will be a review that goes on. It's just that it won't necessarily be at the AAC.
Okay, thank you.
The Historic Site Preservation Board would do that review.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? I know that you'll committee members might think of things in the future, and Flynn's email is always available. But I think you've done a great job. A lot of work went into this, Flynn.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
let me say this as well. In case you do have additional comments, we have the public hearing before the Planning Commission on Wednesday. This doesn't go forward to the City Council until March the 25th. So if you do have questions or comments, feel free to email me between now and, March the 25th. That still gives us the opportunity to look at those and maybe make some tweaks along the way if we need to do that. So there still is the opportunity for input.
Okay, is everybody, no more comments now? Shall we adjourn?
Sounds good.
Okay, adjourning at 6:40. Thank you all for being here for a special meeting off schedule. And thank you, Flynn.
Thank you all. We appreciate it.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.